The desert sun had a way of bleaching the world until all things seemed older than they were. On the far edge of the New Mexico frontier, where mesquite bushes rattled like bones in the wind, a woman named Eleanor Hayes lived alone in a house she had built with her late husband more than 20 years ago. The boards were weather-worn, the paint stripped away, and so was she. At 52, Eleanor had carried her share of seasons: spring's promise, summer's fire, autumn's slow fading, and now, what she called her winter, even though her hair was still only streaked with gray and her eyes still held their sharp, steel-blue glow. She was not the kind of woman men courted anymore. Once, maybe, long ago, when she had worn a dress without patches and danced barefoot in the barn while her husband strummed the fiddle. But those days had been swallowed by war, sickness, and silence. Her husband had been gone for 15 years, her children grown and scattered across the territories, too far to visit and too poor to write often. So she tilled her garden, sold eggs in town, and spoke to no one unless necessary. She carried herself upright, like a woman determined to show the world she could weather loneliness without flinching. But at night, when the lamp burned low, she often whispered into the emptiness, "I'm too old for love now," not bitterly, not with tears, simply as fact. And yet fate has its ways of circling back. It began on a late autumn afternoon. Eleanor rode her mule into town with a basket of eggs tied to the saddle. The streets of the little settlement were loud with cattle drivers, wagons, and the rough music of saloons. She hated it. Too much noise, too many strangers. She dropped her eggs at the general store, collected her coins, and turned to leave. That's when she first saw him, a tall cowboy, broad-shouldered, with dust clinging to his coat and beard touched with silver. He was leaning against the hitching post outside the store, sipping water from a tin cup, as though the whole town spun around him and he didn't much care. Their eyes met for just a second. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just nodded his head in a slow, respectful way, like he was tipping his hat without moving it. And Eleanor, against her will, felt something she hadn't felt in years. The pulse of being seen. She turned quickly, scolding herself. Foolish. You're too old for that nonsense. Too old for love. But when she climbed back onto her mule and set off down the dusty road, she realized she kept glancing back. And every time she did, the cowboy was still there, watching her disappear, as if he'd been waiting for her all his life. "Partner, before the sun sets, pull that trigger on subscribe and ride with us through the Wild West." The cowboy's name was Thomas Reed, though most men on the trail just called him Reed. He had spent his life drifting across the frontier, chasing wages, storms, and shadows. Born in Missouri, he had taken up ranch work at 14, broken horses at 17, and carried a gun since the first time he rode with a cattle drive. By the time Eleanor Hayes noticed him in that dusty town, Reed had already crossed 50. Like her, he had lines carved deep by wind and grief. His beard was peppered gray, his hands scarred and thick with rope burns, and his eyes, hazel, steady, the kind that had seen too much, hid a loneliness he never spoke of. He had known love once. A girl in Kansas long ago who died before they could marry. After that, Reed had convinced himself that love was a boy's dream, not a man's duty. So he rode from ranch to ranch, always with a saddle, but never with a home. Yet something shifted the moment he saw Eleanor step out of the general store that autumn day. She wasn't a girl anymore, no. She carried herself like a fortress, like someone who had outlived storms and buried half her heart in the earth. And still, there was a beauty in her carriage. In the proud way she kept her chin high while tying her mule. In the way her eyes refused to seek approval, yet betrayed a secret ache. Reed watched her leave, and a thought struck him like a spur digging deep. That woman. I've been waiting for her, even if I didn't know it. 2 days later, their paths crossed again. Eleanor was hauling a small wagon of firewood when one of the wheels broke loose on a rocky slope. The wagon tilted, spilling logs across the ground. She cursed under her breath and bent to lift one of the heavier pieces when a shadow fell across her. "Need a hand, ma'am?" The voice was deep, calm, with the timbre of someone who wasn't in a hurry. She looked up and there he was, the cowboy from town, reins in one hand, the other already reaching down to help. "I can manage," Eleanor said briskly. "I don't doubt it," Reed replied, kneeling anyway. "But it goes quicker with two." Together they gathered the scattered logs. He worked in silence, moving with an easy strength that didn't boast, didn't demand thanks. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at him, annoyed that her heart was doing a little dance it had no business doing. When the wagon was steady again, Reed wiped his brow and gave her that same quiet nod. "Name's Thomas Reed," she hesitated, then answered. "Eleanor Hayes," the way he said her name afterward, softly, as if testing how it tasted in his mouth, made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in decades. After that day, Reed seemed to appear wherever she went. Not intrusively, not like a hound, but as though the world itself had conspired to place him along her path. At the market, he carried her flour sacks without asking. At church, he sat in the pew behind her, silent but near. Once, when she dropped a jar of preserves on the street, he was the first to kneel and gather the shards, cutting his hand in the process, but smiling like it was nothing. Eleanor began to feel restless in his presence. She told herself she was too old for courtship, too old for longing. And yet, every time Reed looked at her, there was no mockery, no pity. Only a kind of reverence, as if he had spent his life walking through deserts just to find her oasis. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Eleanor found herself standing on her porch. Staring down the dirt road that led to town, she whispered into the cooling air, "I'm too old for love." But even as she said it, part of her wondered, if love didn't belong to the young, then perhaps it belonged even more fiercely to those who had waited, who had suffered, who had lost. And somewhere in the distance, Reed rode beneath the twilight, carrying the weight of his years, but also a hope he had almost forgotten he could feel. Winter came slow that year, creeping in with sharp winds that carried dust across the plains. The nights were longer, the air colder, and the silence around Eleanor's house seemed heavier than usual. She had lived through many winters alone, but this one felt different, because every time she sat by the fire, she caught herself wondering where Reed was, what he was doing, and whether his trail would ever cross hers again. She scolded herself for it. A woman her age had no business daydreaming like some farm girl waiting for a suitor. But the truth gnawed at her. She had started to look for him, in town, on the road, even in the spaces of her daily chores, and Reed, he seemed to know it. One late afternoon, Eleanor was fixing the fence by her barn when she heard hoofbeats. She turned and saw Reed approaching slowly, reins loose in his hand. His horse was tired, his coat dusted with frost. "Fence won't fix itself," she said dryly, trying to keep her guard. "No, ma'am," Reed replied, swinging down from his horse. But two pairs of hands mend it faster. She wanted to protest, but he was already lifting the broken post, holding it steady while she hammered the nails. They worked side by side as the sky turned pink and gold. Their hands brushed once, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her face, though the wind was cold enough to bite. When the last board was set, Reed leaned on the fence and looked at her. Not like a man appraising a woman, but like someone seeing into a locked room. "You live out here alone?" he asked gently. 15 years now. That's a long time to keep quiet company. I've had enough voices in my life. Husband, children, neighbors." She picked up the hammer, avoiding his gaze. Silence doesn't argue, doesn't leave. Reed studied her for a moment, then said, "Silence don't keep you warm either." His words struck harder than the hammer she held. For a second, she almost let her heart betray her. Almost. Over the next weeks, Reed came by often, not to intrude, but to lend a hand. He chopped firewood without being asked, patched the roof before the snow fell, and once brought her a sack of coffee beans, saying only, "Figured you might be running low." Each gesture wore at Eleanor's defenses. She found herself making extra bread, setting aside more stew, telling herself it was for the neighbors when in truth it was for him. One evening, as they sat at her table, Reed spoke more than usual. "I've spent my life on the move," he said, staring into his tin cup. "Never had much waiting for me anywhere. I thought that was freedom. Turns out it was just emptiness with a saddle on it. Eleanor stirred the stew quietly. "And now?" He looked at her then, his hazel eyes steady. "Now I know what I was waiting for. Took me 50 years to see it clear." Her hands trembled and she set the spoon down too hard. "You don't know what you're saying, Thomas. I'm too old for love. That part of my life's finished." Reed leaned forward. His voice was low, but it carried weight, like the rumble before thunder. "Maybe for you it feels finished. But for me, it feels like it's just beginning. And I've waited my whole life for that beginning." Eleanor's breath caught. For years, she had believed her story was done, her heart buried beside her husband in the churchyard. Yet here was this man, weathered by dust and time, telling her she was not the end of a chapter but the start of one. She pushed back her chair suddenly and stood. "You should go." Reed rose slowly, tipping his hat as if to honor her command, though his eyes never wavered. "I'll go," he said, "but I'll keep coming back. Not to break you down, Eleanor, just to remind you, life don't end until it ends. And love don't wear out just because the years do." When he left, the cabin felt colder than ever. She stood by the window, watching him disappear into the dark, her hand pressed against the glass as if to stop him. And in that silence, Eleanor whispered again, but softer this time. "Too old for love." Yet for the first time, the word sounded less like a truth and more like a lie she had been telling herself for far too long. The first snow of winter fell hard across the plains, blanketing the world in silence. Eleanor woke that morning to find her garden buried, the fences rimmed with white, the air sharp enough to sting her lungs. Winter was always her hardest season, but this year it felt heavier, as though something inside her wrestled as fiercely as the storm outside. She had not seen Reed for nearly a week. After she sent him away with those sharp words, part of her had expected him to vanish, to drift back into the endless trails he spoke of. That would have been easier, cleaner. But every day she found herself glancing down the road, half hoping, half dreading that familiar silhouette. On the 7th day, he came. Eleanor was splitting kindling when she heard hoofbeats crunching through snow. She didn't turn, but her hands faltered on the axe. Reed dismounted quietly, brushing snow from his coat. "I brought supplies," he said simply, holding up a burlap sack. "Coffee, flour, lamp oil. Thought you might need them." "I don't recall asking," she answered, sharper than she intended. "You didn't." He set the sack on her porch and leaned against the rail. "But I came anyway." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hiss of wind. Finally, Eleanor dropped the axe and faced him. "Why are you doing this, Thomas? What do you want from me?" Reed's hazel eyes met hers without flinching. "I want nothing but your company. I've spent half a century talking to horses, drunks, and the wind. I reckon I've earned a chance to speak with someone who matters." Her chest tightened. She turned away, gripping the porch post until her knuckles whitened. "You don't understand. I gave all I had to give, to my husband, to my children, to this land. There's nothing left in me." Reed stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Then let me carry what's left. Love don't need to be young or fierce to be real. Sometimes it's strongest when it's quiet, when it's just two people who've known loss, finding a little warmth in the cold." That night, the storm worsened. Snow piled against the cabin door, and the wind howled through the eaves. Eleanor sat by the fire, blanket around her shoulders, staring into the flames. When a knock sounded at her door, her heart leapt into her throat. She opened it to find Reed standing there, snow clinging to his beard, his breath fogging in the freezing air. "Barn's near caved in," he said. "Your mule won't last the night out there. I'll help you move it inside." Together they fought the storm, shoving against the snowdrift to reach the barn. Reed's strong hand steadied her when she slipped on the ice. Inside, they led the mule into the warmest stall, spreading hay and covering it with old blankets. By the time they returned to the cabin, they were both soaked and shivering. Eleanor lit another lamp, the glow casting soft shadows across the room. Reed removed his coat, steam rising from the wet fabric. He looked older in that light, the lines of his face deeper, his hair grayer. And yet there was a steadiness in him that made her heart ache. "Stay," she said quietly, surprising herself. "The storm won't let you ride back." He nodded, saying nothing. but his eyes softened in gratitude. Hours later, they sat by the fire, a kettle of coffee between them. Eleanor found herself speaking of things she had locked away for years: her husband's death from fever, the long nights when her children cried for food she couldn't provide, the mornings when she wondered if she'd survive another day alone. Reed listened without judgment, his gaze never leaving hers. When she finished, she shook her head bitterly. "Do you see now? I'm too old, Thomas. Too tired. Love has no place here. All I have is memory." Reed leaned forward, his hands folded. "Eleanor, I've been waiting my whole life. Not for youth, not for beauty, not for some fairy tale. I've been waiting for someone who knows what it means to endure. Someone who's walked through fire and come out standing. That's you. You're what I've been waiting for." Her eyes filled, though she tried to blink it back. "And if I let you in, what then? When time takes the rest of me? When there's nothing left but gray hair and a body too weak to carry wood?" Reed reached across the table, covering her trembling hands with his. His voice was rough, almost breaking. "Then I'll still be here. Because I didn't come for a season, Eleanor. I came for the rest. For the first time in 15 years, Eleanor let the tears fall. Not for grief, not for loneliness, but for the terrifying, beautiful truth that her heart was still alive, still capable of beating for another." She pulled her hands away and stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The storm outside roared, snowflakes slashing against the glass like shards. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of decision. Finally, she whispered, not to him, not even to herself, but to the night, "Maybe I'm not too old after all." Behind her, Reed rose slowly. He didn't touch her, didn't force the moment. He only stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, steady and unyielding, like a hearth that would not burn out. And for the first time, Eleanor did not push him away. The storm raged through the night, battering the little cabin until the roof groaned and the windows shuddered. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed, throwing its light across two figures who sat in silence. Eleanor stood by the window, her back straight, her eyes locked on the furious white outside. Reed sat in the chair near the hearth, patient, still, waiting, not for the storm to pass, but for her. Hours slipped by. At last, Eleanor turned, her face streaked from tears she hadn't bothered to wipe. She studied him, this man who had drifted through deserts and rivers, who had wandered half a lifetime only to end up on her porch, offering her the very thing she had sworn she no longer wanted. "You're a fool. Thomas Reed," she said softly. "Wouldn't be the first time I've been called that. And stubborn, that too. And yet—" Her voice cracked, her shoulders slumping, as if she'd finally laid down a weight she'd carried for years. "You're still here." Reed rose slowly, his boots scuffing the wooden floor. He stopped only a step away, careful not to push farther than she allowed. His eyes were steady, warm. "I told you, Eleanor. I've waited my whole life for this. I ain't turning back now." For a moment, neither spoke. The storm howled, rattling the walls, but inside the air was heavy with something else, something alive. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, her breath shorten. All the walls she had built across the years stood trembling like thin boards in a gale. "Do you know what you're asking?" she whispered. "Yes, I'm asking for your winters, your summers, your quiet mornings, and your restless nights. I'm asking for whatever's left, however long it is, and I'm offering mine in return." She stared at him, her lips parting as if to argue, but no argument came. The truth was written in his face, carved deeper than time could erase. He meant it. He meant every word. Eleanor stepped forward, just enough that she could feel the heat of him, the faint scent of leather and wood smoke. Her hand lifted, hesitant, trembling, and then settled against his chest. She felt the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. For years she had convinced herself her own heart was a grave. But here it was, answering his, beating faster, stronger, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. Reed's breath hitched, and with infinite patience he covered her hand with his own. "Eleanor," he murmured, her name breaking in his throat like prayer. She tilted her chin up, and before she could second-guess herself, his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then firmer. Not the desperate kiss of youth, but the steady promise of two souls who had lived long enough to know what it meant to keep one. when they pulled apart. The firelight caught the tears on her cheeks. She laughed then, a soft, disbelieving laugh. I thought I was too old for love. Reed brushed a strand of gray hair from her face, his smile faint but fierce. No such thing. Love don't follow calendars. It just waits, sometimes longer than we'd like. They stood in the glow of the fire, her head resting against his chest, his arms finally holding what he had searched for across all his wandering years. The storm outside no longer mattered. The winter no longer felt so bitter. The days that followed were different. Reed stayed through the storm, mending fences, feeding the mule, carrying water from the frozen well. Elena found herself setting 2 bowls instead of 1, brewing extra coffee, humming songs she hadn't thought of in decades. At night they sat by the fire, speaking of the lives they had lived apart. Reed told her of the cattle drives, the rivers crossed, the loneliness that had followed him like a shadow. Elena spoke of her children, of her husband, of the years she had spent burying her own wants beneath survival. Each story was a brick lifted from the wall between them. And slowly, what began as companionship grew into something unshakable, something neither of them had believed was possible anymore. By the time spring thawed the land, the little cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. There was laughter again, low and rare but real. There was conversation at dawn, coffee steaming between 2 pairs of hands. There were long walks beyond the fence line, their steps slow, steady, side by side. Eleanor Hayes no longer whispered to herself that she was too old for love. She no longer watched the horizon with longing for things gone. Because love had come, not like a lightning strike of youth, but like a steady flame that refuses to die, even in the coldest winter, and Thomas Reed, the cowboy who had wandered a lifetime, finally found the one place he would never ride away from. Together, they stood at the edge of the world, not as 2 souls who had run out of time, but as 2 who had finally learned what time was for. And in their silence, there was warmth. And in their years there was love,